See if we can get rid of some screens here. Good evening and welcome. I'm Eugene Beach, president of the Highland Township Historical Society, and this is the second of our talks on the history of Highland's various lakes. Once again, let me start by thanking Kathy Buhner and all the folks here at the library for sponsoring these presentations. Let me also give a little plug to our society. We're a small group, but we have a lot of fun. We publish a regular newsletter that is filled with a lot of interesting information about Highland and Highland people. And we try to meet, at least before the pandemic, every month from September to June. We've kind of stretched things out a little bit, but we do have a lot of fun getting together. And we always have a holiday dinner in December, and then try to have a summer picnic as well. $15, and if you're at all interested in Highland history, we'd more than love to have you. Finally, I have to say on a personal note, give a little shout out to my two granddaughters, Samantha and Emma, who apparently watched the first presentation on Zoom, and Emma, who was only 3, couldn't quite understand why she couldn't talk back and forth to Papa. So hi Sam, hi Emma, and we'll see you here in a couple of days probably. Tonight is devoted to our 2 largest lakes, White Lake and Duck Lake. And let me say right up front that there is no possible way to cover every facet of their history in one evening. So forgive me if I don't mention your specific subdivision or some question that you've always had. I hope, however, that what I am able to share with you will be both informative and interesting. As we saw in our last presentation, both of these are classic kettle lakes that are bordered by outwash plain, and so they are fairly shallow for their size, particularly around the shorelines. This is, let's see here. This is the problem with trying to do Zoom, and there we go. This is one of those maps that was prepared back in the 50s by the Institute for Fisheries Research. And as you'll notice, I've highlighted the 10-foot contours of the lake bottom in blue. So everything inside the blue lines is at 10 foot or greater, but everything else is less than 10 feet. Quite a substantial part of White Lake. Duck Lake is even more dramatic, with only the northern part at 10 feet or greater. Admittedly, these are maps from the 50s, and I'm sure that the depths have been changed a bit with dredging and so forth, but it's illustrative of the fact that both lakes had some fairly shallow shorelines. Now, the reason I bring that up is because even a classic large kettle lake can over time eventually shrink, and in some cases disappear entirely. Those shallow shorelines are a perfect environment for cattails, marsh grass, and other water-loving plants. And as those things sit there, they can capture leaves and pine needles and other things that are maybe blown in, as well as soil that may be washed down during rainstorms. And as the centuries roll by, the organic matter can start to decay and accumulate on the bottom, building up a layer of peat or muck. And as that goes on, you can start to get even some larger plants like tamarack or willow that add their debris to the mix. And as you can see, the shoreline eventually creeps inward, and the areas of open water start to shrink. So it's fair to say that the way these lakes looked when the pioneers first arrived is quite different than the way they look today. Now, as I mentioned at the last session, the earliest settlers in this township avoided lakes and wetlands for 2 reasons. One, they were worthless from an agricultural point of view, can't farm in the middle of a lake. And secondly, they had a justifiable fear that these wet marshy areas could be unhealthy. And this was a problem not just in Highland, but all over the state. It's estimated that back when settlement in Michigan began, there were over 10 million acres, or roughly 17% of the state, was wet, marshy ground of one sort or another. So among the earliest laws that the legislature passed were some that established first township and later county and inter-county drain commissions, which when requested could order the construction of ditches and pipelines and dams and other structures so that all of this low-lying land could be drained and made more productive. And what's more, these commissions had and still have the power to form assessment districts and to tax the beneficiaries of these drains for the cost of building and maintaining them. Over the years since, it's estimated that some 35 to 50% of our original wetlands in this state have in fact been drained. Now in the 1880s, there were only a handful of families that owned land around both of these lakes. And since they were all farmers, the idea of clearing out these marshy, shallow shorelines and gaining access to that rich bottomland was undoubtedly attractive. So it probably wasn't very hard to collect the necessary number of signatures on a request to have the drain commissioner install some drains. Obviously, they could not empty either lake completely. They are both much too deep for that, but because of those shallow shorelines that extended out a fair distance, even dropping the lakes by 3 or 4 feet could still uncover a considerable amount of new land that could then be burned over or otherwise cleared out and cultivated, or grazed, or maybe even dig out the muck and spread it on some of your other fields like compost. So in August of 1886, the Oakland County Drain Commissioner published this notice in various papers. This one is from the Milford Times, soliciting bids to construct the first segment of what was known as the White and Duck Lake Drain. Now that notice goes on to give a rather lengthy list of technical specifications, which I've tried to summarize here in this map. Basically, you started with a 428-foot long open ditch from the south end of Duck Lake, running more or less due south. That then entered a 2-foot diameter drain pipe. They needed the pipe to get underneath a kind of sandy ridge that was there that would make a ditch kind of impractical. That pipe then ran to almost the north side of Wardlow Road, where it then opened up in another ditch that went under a wooden bridge for Wardlow and discharged on the south side of the road into the wetlands that eventually drain into Alderman Lake. A contract was thereafter awarded, and on September 24th of that year, the Pontiac Gazette noted that the work was pushing forward, while the Milford Times published this item on October 16th, noting that tile, meaning the pipe, for the Duck Lake Drain has arrived and are being put in place. When they finally opened the gates on December 1 of 1886, however, the initial flow of water was so great that the banks of the open ditch started to get eroded and collapse. So they had to shut everything down and make some repairs. But when they finally got the flow rate properly adjusted, the level of Duck Lake dropped roughly 3.5 to 4 feet to something around 1,013.56 feet above sea level. And we can kind of see the result on this USGS map from 1909. As you'll notice, the whole northwestern part of the lake, everything up there around Chevron and Pepper Trail and so forth, is all shown as either dry or marshland. And even the southern end of the lake is more constricted and narrow. The surface area has shrunk considerably compared to what we know today. By the way, this dotted blue line here at the bottom of that map represents the original location of that drain. And we also have this old photo that shows the discharge through the 2-foot pipe that they installed there. 6 months later, in June of 1887, another contract was awarded for phase 2 of the project, which consisted of a drain between White Lake and Duck Lake. And this involved putting in an 18-inch pipe on the northwest shore of White Lake that ran under Duck Lake Road, more or less due west, and then entered an open ditch that ran west, basically between today's Campers Drive and Fisherman's Court, and into the northeast part of Duck Lake. And once that drain was opened, the level of White Lake also dropped by roughly 3 feet to approximately 1,016 feet above sea level. Today, of course, the level is 119.1 above sea level. That drain, by the way, is still there, although I'm not sure how much water actually goes through it anymore. This is a photo from 1940. You can see that dark line there between fishermen's and campers that I've kind of highlighted with the arrows. That was the original open ditch. And even today, there is a lot on the north side of Campers that is vacant. I suspect because the right-of-way for the drain cuts through the back of the property and makes it difficult to build on. Now, while the owners of all the land around the lakes were probably happy for all this additional land that they were getting, the folks who had enjoyed the lakes for fishing or picnicking, other activities, were less enthusiastic. The Pontiac Gazette item that I mentioned earlier says that there is some talk of lowering White Lake by running it into Duck Lake. If they do, it'll be a pity, for it will not improve the lake at all. And the Milford Times in September said that sportsmen and picnickers will be sorry to learn that the contract of draining Duck Lake and White Lake has been let, and the work is actively going on. There were also complaints that these new drains somehow disrupted the flow of water that was reaching Alderman Lake, which, as we saw last time, is basically the mill pond for the old Spring Mills grist mill. In July of 1887, the Milford Times reported that the mill was suffering for water and blamed these drains for it. And a year later, it ran this item saying that not only the grist mill, but also the vinegar works that was downstream are short of water. The White and Duck Lake drains are blamed for it. The irony there is that the grist mill was actually included in the assessment district on the theory that these drains would increase the flow of water into the mill pond. They were paying as much or more in taxes than any of the surrounding landowners on the lake itself, and yet they claimed they weren't getting as much water as they used to. Ultimately, however, these drains really didn't prove the disaster that many folks had feared. And indeed, they may have unwittingly contributed, at least indirectly, to both lakes' eventual recreational potential, precisely because they made it easier to clear up the shorelines. Of course, Duck Lake was never much of a recreational lake in the early days. There are a handful of references to some of the families surrounding the lake having family reunions or picnics, and I was able to find one mention of it, visit by the Flint Fishing Club that was spending time there on the lake. But other than that, you don't find the kind of church or school picnics or overnight camp trips that characterized Pettibone or Dunham, or, as we'll see, White Lake. One reason for that, I suspect, is that there were parts of Duck Lake that were a muddy mess. Even after the drains were installed, in October of 1895, for example, the Times reported that a horse belonging to Ben Shoebridge had gone missing for 8 days until it was found mired at the edge of Duck Lake with only its head visible. So that muck along the shorelines was a problem. Now, in contrast, White Lake has a long history of recreational use, going back to the earliest days of settlement. But prior to the 1890s, most of that occurred on the White Lake Township side, and particularly up in the northeast corner around where the White Lake Inn is today. Durant's 1877 History of Oakland County, for example, says that, quote, "The lake is frequented during the summer by excursion and picnic parties," but he only says that in his chapter on White Lake Township. There's no corresponding mention of that in Highland. There are several reasons why that might be so. As we saw last time, the old White Lake Indian Trail, the dotted line here, ran along the lake's northeast shore, and the native peoples are known to have camped in that area during their trips back and forth to Detroit. So I suspect there was probably some areas that had already been cleared out and which the pioneers simply continued to maintain and use. Also remember that since our winds are predominantly out of the west, it would be folks on the east side of the lake that would have enjoyed the cooling breezes. And lastly, as we saw last time, there actually weren't a lot of people living on the west or Highland side of the lake in the early days. And the folks who were in Central Highland, Spring Mills, Highland Station, or even West Highland, had other lakes like Lower Pettibone or Dunham that were closer by. Now, as I said, the earliest references are to this area in the northeast of White Lake, which came to be known as Voorhees Landing. So we're talking about the intersection of Ormond Road and Jackson Boulevard, basically where the White Lake Inn sits. It was called Voorhees Landing because, as you can see, it's on the land that was owned by pioneer Peter Voorhees. There's the PV there on the map. And the fact that it was called a landing indicates that it was an area in which folks would launch their boats out into the lake. And indeed, Durant's history has this old engraving that shows people doing just that. This view is looking basically west-southwest. So you've got what is today Ormond Road running from the left side of the picture to the right, and the little stub road going off to the left would be Jackson Boulevard going east. If you notice at the right side of the picture, there are 3 men that look like they're either launching a boat or retrieving one, and there are a couple other boats that are out there on the lake. We also have some early postcards taken in the early 1900s showing this same area. This again is looking basically west-southwest. The road that runs from left to right would be Ormond Road. The one that is labeled Road to J.H. Smith's would be today's Jackson Boulevard. And you can even see what appears to be a shadow of a boat there. And then we have this card, which was taken basically looking the same way, but with the camera positioned a little more up the hill. The popularity of this area is also demonstrated by the fact that this 1896 map identifies the little point of land just west of the White Lake Inn as a picnic grounds. And by 1908, that area was owned by Mr. Smith, and it was a series of cottages that was known as Lakeview Resort. Starting in the mid-1890s, however, the part of White Lake that is in Highland Township finally started to come into its own, thanks to the efforts of this man. James W. Lockwood. He was a local boy, served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and following his discharge, returned here to Highland, where in 1868 he married Emily Beaumont. Her family is the one that owned the land on the west side of the lake that eventually became Seven Harbors. Now, as it turns out, Emily had a sister, Eliza, who had herself married just a month or two before to James Taylor. And since money was tight, the two sisters and their new husbands decided to all move in together and live on the old Taylor farm that was in the southwest corner of White Lake. And you can see that on this map from 1872. Basically everything north of 59 and east of Duck Lake Road. But of course, once children started to arrive, things got a little crowded. So they decided to divide the property. The Taylors took the west half that I've outlined there in blue, and Lockwood took the east half that is outlined in red. Now, Lockwood was a farmer, so most of his land would have been cleared of its original tree cover. And indeed, if we look at this aerial from 1940, you see that a lot of it was still cleared. But there was this area in the north that jutted out into the lake that was hilly and therefore not worth cultivating, and the tree cover was accordingly left more or less undisturbed. And that area soon became known as Lockwood's Grove. Now, as I mentioned last time, or promised last time, I was going to talk about the significance of groves like this back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So let me take a second to do this. Today, we think of Highland as sort of a wooded paradise with trees everywhere you look. But well into the 1940s, there were big portions of this township that looked more like Iowa, with open farm fields as far as the eye can see. I always smile when people talk about how lovely the trees are here at the library or across the lake or across 59 where my family property is. Looks just wonderful, doesn't it? In 1940, it was all open field. My grandfather and uncle used it to grow potatoes. And it wasn't until my uncle became interested in forestry and started his tree farm business that he set out all of these pine trees, which if you look closely and walk through them, they're all in 10-foot centers. To give you another example, this is Timber Ridge subdivision there on the right, just west of the new fire hall, north side of 59, and we have the cobblestone subdivision next door to it. And as you can see, even though this was taken in the winter when the trees were leafless, there's still a lot of tree cover in between all those lots and in the common areas. In 1940, it looked like that, okay? Open fields everywhere. What you need to remember is that for the pioneers and the generations of farmers who followed them, trees were good for only two things: timber to build with and firewood to heat with. Other than that, they were a nuisance that you chopped down, dug out, burned up, and otherwise cleared so that you could plow and plant a crop. So well into the 40s, oftentimes the only place you would find mature trees was either along property lines, fence lines, or in dedicated woodlots. It was customary to keep 20 acres that you could rotate through to cut firewood, or in areas that were either too wet or too hilly to make it worth cultivating. But, you know, after the Civil War, there was an increasing interest in this country in outdoor activities of all kinds: picnics, hiking, swimming, boating, fishing, camping, you name it. You had increasing numbers of people that were being jammed into these cities who were looking for a place to escape the heat and the smells and the smoke and the noise. You had tens of thousands of Union war veterans who were joining the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And they would either hold day-long picnics, or often they would hold week-long campouts where they would pitch their tents and invite the family out and give them a taste of what life had been like in the Army camps during the war. And you had other groups, churches, schools, fraternal organizations, clubs of all kinds that were looking to have quiet places where they could get away from it all and enjoy a leisurely day of picnicking and swimming and so forth. And finally, of course, this was at the end of the Romantic period, which had, among other things, stimulated the new appreciation of the beauties of nature. And this is when, for example, landscape painting starts to become popular. And starting with Walden in 1854, you start seeing an increasing number of books that are touting not only the physical benefits, but also the spiritual benefits of communing with nature. So it is no surprise that when people in our area began looking for places to enjoy the outdoors, they were drawn to all of these little tree-covered oases that offered shade, cooling breezes, and the chance to swim or boat or fish and camp. And just about every major lake in our area had at least one such grove, and oftentimes more than that. As we saw last time, Lower Pettibone had Adams Grove on the west side, Yarrington's Grove on the east side. Dunham Lake had Lee's Grove, Feeney's Grove, and Charlick's Grove. Down in Milford, you had Foots Grove, which was downstream of the village on the river. And you had Hales Grove, which was upstream on the east side. Oxbow Lake had Teggardine's Grove. Commerce Lake had Lynch's Grove. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And you even find a number of these popular spots around White Lake being renamed. For example, Jackson's Grove, after landowner Joe Jackson, and Smith's Grove after landowner Jacob Smith. Also on the east side of the lake, you had Ormond's Grove, which eventually evolved into the Little Ormond Beach Resort. Pardon? Nope. Now, exactly when or why James Lockwood decided to make use of his lakeside grove is unclear. But we do know that he and his brother-in-law had helped set up and attended a big multi-day GAR reunion that was held at the north end of White Lake in 1888. So he was clearly aware of the possibilities. And what's more, I'm sure he appreciated the fact that his grove, since it was at the south end of the lake on the Highland side, was 2.5 miles closer to folks that were not only in Highland Station, but maybe coming from out of town and getting off at the Highland Depot. The earliest reference that I found to it is this one from 1895, August, where he hosted a day-long picnic for the local GAR post. 80 people showed up. Highland Band was there to provide music, and as you can see, they spent the day boating, fishing, swapping Army yarns, and other diversions. So right off the bat, he's hosting some of these pretty big crowds. 3 years later, in July of 1898, the Milford Farmers Club decided to hold their annual picnic at Lockwood's Grove. Prior to this time, they had usually held it at the farm of one of their members, but this time they all traveled all the way up here to Island to enjoy the scenery at White Lake. And as the Times later reported, it was a very pleasant affair and largely attended. Now, these early gatherings that Lockwood hosted seem to have been mostly one-day events. There may have been some overnight campers, but if so, it didn't make the papers. And I haven't found anything to suggest, at least early on, that he was charging anyone to use the grove, although I'm sure some of these larger groups probably offered him some form of honorarium, or at the very least shared the victuals with him. But in 1899, we find him finally taking the plunge and putting money and effort into making his grove into a true resort. In January of 1899, the Times reported that Thomas McCall has been building 2 or 3 new summer cottages for James Lockwood at White Lake. And 5 months later, the Milford Times published this rather lengthy review of the place, written by the Highland Station correspondent who had gone out there to spend the day. Let me just read a couple illustrative sentences. Seeing is believing, and a recent visit to the James Lockwood camping grounds demonstrates to our mind that White Lake is bound to be a summer resort. The close proximity of these grounds to Clyde, Highland Station, and Milford, and located as they are up the banks of the beautiful White Lake, warrant the assertion that the Lockwood camping grounds will be a popular resort. Mr. Lockwood, in addition to previous outlays, has added several more cottages and boats, and now has the facilities for accommodating the public. So 1899 marked a turning point when Lockwood's Grove transitioned from being a place that might hold or host occasional picnics or day-long events to a true money-making resort that offered a variety of amenities for paying guests. And these guests included not only local folks, but an increasing number of out-of-town visitors. In July of 1905, for example, the Times noted that several of the cottages have been rented. Saginaw, Toledo, and Alliance, Ohio people are among the resorters now on hand. So we're drawing from quite a distance away. They'd all come and get off on the train. A few years later, in 1911, the Times noted that so many people were getting off the train that the local livery agent had trouble ferrying them all out back and forth. He was running out of horses and buggies. Neither was this business limited to the summer months. In November of 1903, for example, it said that there were at least 75 duck hunters who were occupying not only these cottages, but tents all around White Lake. Of course, Lockwood continued to host big one-day events. He had another large GAR picnic and a 4th of July celebration that was put on by the local Knights of the Maccabees. One of the ones I found interesting is this one from 1900, where his son John organized a Bowery dance. Now, for those of you that have never heard that term, a Bowery dance was a dance that was held under a bower. Basically, they would build a giant pergola or framework, cover it with pine boughs or other nice smelling branches of fresh greenery, and that provided a shady and nice smelling spot under which the young people could dance. And I suppose if you were there and had nice breeze coming off the lake and the smell of the pine needles, little rays of sunlight coming down through the holes in the branches, it was probably pretty pleasant. The popularity of Lockwood's is also demonstrated by the fact that we have at least 5 or 6 different postcards and souvenir photos that either mention it by name or are clearly depicting it. Here, for example, is a view of the Grove looking south from the water. Initially, I thought this might have been taken from Hubble's Island, but I did some photogrammetry and the lines don't quite line up. So somebody was out there in a boat taking that photo. You can see a couple of the cottages up in the woods, and to the right is the boat livery. Here's another similar photo. You can see this one's labeled Lockwood's Grove. Kind of hard to see the cottages, but the boat livery stands out rather nicely. Here is a close-up view of the boat livery looking east across the waters of what came to be known as Lockwood's Cove. Notice, by the way, the little catboat there on the left that guests could rent and spend a morning or afternoon sailing up and down the entire lake. Here's another card that was taken from the boat livery looking west across the cove to what was called Lockwood's Point, basically the northern end of today's Lockwood Drive. The former Derrick Coleman house sits there right at the end of that point of land. Here's another similar view of the same area. This one is entitled simply A Pretty Spot, but it was clearly taken from the boat livery. You can see the rowboats on the shore, a little catboat there at the left, and a couple people out rowing around. And lastly, we have this view. It was sort of tinted or colorized postcard labeled Lockwood's Point. And again, we see the catboat, and to the left of it there, close to shore, is another rowboat with, looks like a party of 3 young ladies. Now, as I mentioned, James Taylor, who was Lockwood's brother-in-law, owned a parcel to the west side of the point, which, while it didn't have a grove, still had good lake access. And as the demand for these cottages increased in the early 1900s, he and his son Emery decided to build their own resort. They started with 2 cottages in 1907, followed by 2 more in 1908, and we have a couple postcards showing those. This view is looking more or less west-southwest. You can see the 3 one-story cottages, and then there was one that was a story and a half. But notice how clear Low Hand is. There are some saplings that have been planted there along the shoreline to try to give a start to some shade, but the rest of the land is pretty doggone open. And here's another view of it, a little more to the north, looking southwest. Again, notice the 3 single-story cottages, the story and a half cottage, but again, look how open the rest of that land is. If you look at the far right of the picture, you can actually see a field with rows of crops. They look like potatoes that runs right down to the shoreline, okay? And maybe a handful of mature trees in the background up along the road. Taylor continued to run this resort until 1912, when he retired and moved here to Highland Station. The property was later acquired by William Blackman, and after that it was called Blackman's Beach. And we have this postcard showing it. These would be the 3 single-story cottages. We're now looking more or less east, and as you can tell, the trees have grown up a little bit. That looks to be about a 1917 Model T, so I suspect it was taken in the late teens. Now, I mentioned Hubble's Island earlier, so let me talk about that. The first thing to know about Hubble's Island is that almost 60 years, nobody wanted it. It wasn't until September of 1888 that Charles W. Hubbard, Hubbard, applied for and received a patent for it. He was a local boy, born in 1851. He was the son of Abel Hubbard of White Lake Township. Eventually became a doctor, practiced initially up in Davisburg and later down in Detroit. Just why he wanted this island, I'm really not sure, but there is no indication that he actually ever did anything with it. In May of 1897, however, Milford Times quoted the Holly Advertiser saying that Hubbard had sold the island to Charles P. Bissell. Bissell was a very well-to-do Holly businessman, president of the Michigan Manufacturing and Lumber Company up there. And 2 years later, the Times reported that Bissell was thinking about moving a cottage that he owned on the shore of White Lake out to the island. Whether he actually did or not is unclear. What we do know is that Bissell soon decided to share the island with 3 other people. The first was his brother, Edward Bissell, who was a Milford lawyer and the one that built that ornate brick house that's there on the corner of Union and Center Streets, the tattoo parlor now, I guess it is. The second was Frank Hubble, who, as we saw last time, owned the Upper Pettibone ice houses, as well as some business ventures down in Milford. And the third was Mark Liddell, who was a partner in the Milford banking firm of Lacey and Liddell. Now, while this group were all successful, serious businessmen, they do seem to have had a rather playful sense of humor. Hubble and Liddell had previously owned a cottage on the shore of White Lake that they had christened La Same, L''S''A''M'. It sounds French, but it was a made-up word using the first letters of each of their children's initials. So it's no surprise that when these four men got together and joined up on this island, they were equally playful by christening it By Who Lie. Sounds Hawaiian, but as the Milford Times reported in 1901, this, the owners tell us, is an Indian name signifying place of rest or comfort. And by a most singular coincidence, the three syllables of the name are the first two letters of the names of the owners: Bissell, Hubble, Liddell. I think that's kind of clever. And for the next 40 years or so, By Who Lie is what it was called. Now, a couple weeks after the island was christened, the Livingston County Press reported that Hubble, at least, was moving forward with plans to build a cottage on it. Just how he ferried all of the material and equipment and men out there, I have no idea, but I'm sure it cost him a pretty penny. And by the end of the year, the other three, the two Bissell brothers and Liddell, apparently had second thoughts, because in December of 1901, the Times reported that they had sold out, with Hubble now the sole owner. Now, the complex that he built was pretty extensive. The main house, as we can see from this old postcard, was 1.5 stories with a great big wraparound porch. It could reportedly sleep 12, and the sitting room and dining room could be opened up into one large space so that they could hold dances and parties. In addition to that, there were 3 smaller cottages on the island, one of which you can see here to the left of this photo. And those provided accommodations for any non-family guests. Here's a close-up of it. You can see the main house up in the right, the cottage there. Notice the stairs leading down to the dock and the big welcome sign to By Who Lie Island. By 1915, however, the charm seems to have worn off, because we see the island listed for sale for only $6,000. It didn't sell right away, however, because as late as 1926, there was a biography of Hubble that indicates he still owned it. But in early 1943, the island was bought by the Presbyterian Church and was renamed Youth Island, and was thereafter used for many years as a summer camp. In fact, I think well into the 70s. They then closed that down, and the property was sold. In 1999, there was a request made to the United States Board of Geographic Names to rename it Hanson Island, which was the name of the father gentleman that had purchased it at the time, but that was rejected. It's spelled with only one L and no apostrophe, which is kind of unfortunate. Now, we are roughly at the halfway point, so let me ask, does anybody feel the need to take a break? Otherwise, I'll just press on. Everybody good? Perfect. Let me shift gears then and talk about the surprisingly sudden end of the resort era. James Lockwood died in 1915. And while his grove hung on for a couple more years, I find no mention of it after 1917. And then in 1918, the Free Press ran this ad for the sale of Smith's Grove, which was up there near Voorhees Landing. And within a couple of years, almost every one of these groves, beaches, resorts, what have you, that were around White Lake, as well as a tremendous amount of farmland that was around Duck Lake, had all been bought up. But the new owners were not looking to host GAR picnics or rent cabins. So why this sudden collapse of a business that, you know, just 15 or 20 years earlier had looked so promising and profitable? Well, the answer I suggest is this. When Lockwood opened his resort in 1899, there were 8,000 cars in this country. By 1920, there were 8 million, many of which were right here in southeastern Detroit area. Remember, too, that it was in 1914 that Ford started paying his line workers $5 an hour. And there were hundreds of white-collar workers, accountants, engineers, lawyers, that I'm sure were getting paid even more. So this period from about 1910 to 1920, pardon me, really is the start of what we call the middle class. People who earned enough to have some disposable income, who had some leisure time, and who, thanks to the automobile, enjoyed a truly unprecedented freedom of movement. The growing number of cars also prompted demands for better roads. The first mile of Woodward, for example, was paved in 1909. And by 1916, it was paved all the way to Pontiac. In 1913, the state of Michigan inaugurated our state trunk line road system, which meant that all of these muddy, hilly, dirt roads suddenly began to be widened and leveled out and paved with at least some gravel, including as Elizabeth Lake Road, Old Elizabeth Lake Road, which, as we saw last time, ran basically from the White Lake Kroger along the current M59 right away, all the way through East Highland to Waterbury Road. Now put yourself in the position of one of these new middle-class families. Why pay to rent a resort cottage for a week or two when for a couple $100, I mean, some of these were sold $5 down, $5 a month. A couple $100 could buy you a lot where you could build your own cottage or a summer home that you could visit anytime you wanted, as many times as you wanted. And when you weren't using it, you could rent it out yourself to your neighbor or your coworker or whatnot, maybe make a few dollars to help you pay for it. So the people who were buying up all of these old resorts, as well as that farmland around Duck Lake, weren't in the resort business. They were looking to subdivide all of this property into lots that they could sell to this growing middle class. One of the earliest of these ventures was the Highlands White Lake Company, which was a partnership between Levi Buck, a real estate broker, and John Tilson, both of them from Pontiac. Tilson was a lawyer. They bought up the northern part of the Lockwood property, basically everything north of Ridge Road, which they platted as the White Lake Highlands subdivision. And as we can see from this ad that they ran in 1920, not only talks about how wooded the property is and the nice beaches and so forth, but it talks about being within easy driving distance of Detroit over perfect roads. And you'll see that formula a lot. Another person who figures very prominently, Harry Giddings. Giddings was born in 1889. He was a local boy, the son of Edward Giddings of White Lake. And of particular interest is that his maternal grandfather was George Lester, who owned this farm at the north end of White Lake, northwest part, and it stretched all the way west to the northeast corner of Duck Lake. So Giddings would have been familiar with both of these lakes from childhood. Now, after a stint in the Navy, he returned to Michigan, and in 1911 started working with a real estate firm in Detroit. But by 1919, he had his own firm and was doing a very brisk business selling lots in all these new subdivisions that were sprouting up along Woodward and out west along the Grand River. And I'm sure that experience gave him the idea of establishing his own developments in and around these lakes that he had known as a boy. The first such venture was, appropriately enough, Lester Park, which is located on his grandfather's former farm on the northeast shore of White Lake. So east of Duck Lake Road, Jackson, Lester, Giddings, as you're going up. The earliest mention that I find of it is this ad from July of 1923, after which similar ads appear more or less regularly in the papers for the next 15, 20 years. What's amazing is how forward-looking a vision this man had for these developments. In 1924, he gave an interview to the Free Press, and not only was he planning to do the usual park and playground and tennis court, he had set aside acreage to put in an airfield, because he was looking forward to the day when the business and professional man will use his plane in going to and from his suburban home. Even today, that's, for most of us, the stuff of science fiction. But I guess if you had grown up in the teens and 20s and witnessed firsthand airplanes and cars and movies and radio and all those technological innovations back in the early 1900s, it maybe wasn't so far-fetched. Giddings also came up with another idea that was ahead of its time, but thankfully a little bit more practical. In July of 1929, he announced what he called Giddings Serve Sell Sale. And basically what this meant was that every unsold lot at Lester Park had a sign on it that gave its size and dimensions and price and all the basic information so that people could browse and not have to interact with the local sales agent unless they wanted to. So he was 80 years ahead of whoever came up with the idea of putting those plastic tubes of brochures on for sale signs like you see today. Another early development that he started, much smaller, is White Oak Beach, which is on the west bank of White Lake, just basically north of the state boat launch. White Oak Beach Drive, a little sort of dead-end street that goes off at an angle there. The earliest mention of it I find is from June of 1924, after which it was common for both it and Lester Park to be mentioned together in the same ad. Now, with two subdivisions already under his belt, you would have thought that Giddings might have paused for a bit. But in mid-1923, plans were announced for the construction of Northwestern Highway, which was to be a totally new road that ran from downtown Detroit across Oakland County all the way to US 23 just south of Fenton. And as we see from this 1920s Oakland County road map, the proposed right-of-way, which I've highlighted in yellow, would have cut right through the middle of Highland Township. Indeed, a stone's throw from where we're sitting this evening. And had that been built, it would have naturally made any of those developments on White Lake and Duck Lake a lot more accessible. So in the late 20s, Giddings began to develop two more subdivisions on White Lake, Kings Row and LaSalle Gardens, both of which were either on or just north of the old Taylor Resort property. And on April of 1929, he gave a interview to the Free Press, and he talks about how Northwestern Highway will be one of the greatest helps in relieving the traffic conditions of Woodward and Grand River, and opening up a new section similar to Bloomfield Hills. And we also find the highway mentioned quite prominently in ads that he starts running later that year. He talks about his developments being right in the line of Detroit's expansion. Paving of the Northwestern Highway will shorten the driving distance from downtown Detroit to White Lake by at least half an hour. Okay, and then he lists all four of his developments. As we all know, however, it was just 2 months later that the stock market crashed, inaugurating the Great Depression, followed by World War II. So as a result, the eventual build out of all four of these subdivisions really didn't happen until after the war. Here's an aerial view of East Highland that was taken about 1948. M59's running there from left to right. Gee's stores on the northwest corner, and then there's Shermer's gas station and grocery, the Wheel. You get on down the road and Cook's service station. But the thing to notice is LaSalle Gardens, except for a handful of houses that are along Lake Drive there, and what is it? Not Poplar, but anyway, there's not a lot of homes. This is just as flat and open as it was 40 years before, when the Taylors were running their resort. Another big name in the history of our lakes residential development is Harry Beaumont. Surprisingly, I can't find a good photograph of him, which is why I'm using the headstone. Born in 1875, he was another local boy. He was the son of John F. Beaumont and was thus nephew to both Eliza Beaumont Taylor and Emily Beaumont Lockwood. As a young man, he spent some time up in Fenton, and then after marriage worked at a men's clothing store down in Detroit. But around 1913, he returned to this area, and so would have witnessed firsthand the decline in the old resorts and the interest that all these other developers had in lakefront property. Now, by the early 20s, he had gained control, if not actual ownership, of the family property there on the northwest part of White Lake, and also a little 80-acre piece that straddled the road and went all the way to the northeast shore of Duck Lake. And starting around 1923, he began to turn this property into a residential development under the name Seven Harbors. Now, to market it, he initially engaged the services of Leinbach Brothers, which was an old established Detroit real estate firm. And the earliest mention I find of it is this one from August of 1924, kind of a one-liner: Seven Harbors, White Lake is a place you will enjoy. You know, not the most scintillating ad copy, but apparently worked, because the following year, the Free Press ran an extensive interview with Charles Addison, who was Leinbach's vice president. And I've lifted a section here. He says, last season, our firm disposed of numerous sites at Seven Harbors located on White and Duck Lake, proving again that Detroiters are getting to the point of affluence where they can maintain, however modest, summer homes in these beauty spots within easy driving distance. So again, we see that same formula. You know, this demand for lakefront property is being driven by a growing middle class with access to cash, cars, and concrete roads. Now, there were a number of later ads in 1925, one of which I just find fascinating. This was a multi-column ad, took up about a quarter of a page, published in May, just before Memorial Day. And as you can see, it includes a very nice stylized map that showed how to get out to Seven Harbors, either Woodward to Pontiac or by taking Old Grand River to New Hudson and coming up through Milford. But what really I find fascinating is the over-the-top text, which proves to me at least why liberal arts majors should not write ad copy. I quote, "Seven Harbors without Mr. Khayyam's loaf of bread and demijohn is paradise enough. It is seventh heaven to the fisherman. It is Elysium to the devotee of sailing, rowing, canoeing, or motorboating. It is the realm celestial to the bathing enthusiast. It is the nature seeker's happy hunting ground." Close quote. So we've got references to the Rubaiyat, medieval astronomy, Jewish Kabbalah, ancient Greek mythology, and Native American religion all rolled up into one ad. Sadly, however, that ad goes on to say that ownership in Seven Harbors, quote, "is rigidly restricted to the ownership of congenial people, insurance of constantly increasing values." Now, today we use the word congenial to refer to someone or something that we find pleasant or agreeable, but it's a Latin word. It comes from con, meaning together, and genius, meaning spirit. So someone who shares the same spirit as you do, the same likes, the same interests. In other words, who is like you. So it was often used as a code word in the early 1900s to mean whites only, which means that all of the people whose cultures that ad is borrowing from, Jews, Persians, Native Americans, maybe even Greeks, are being told, sorry, Seven Harbors isn't for you. Now, within a year or two after that, Beaumont dropped Leinbach. I don't know whether this ad played a part of that or not, but he instead joined with Arnold Schroeder or Schrader. I'm frankly unsure which pronunciation, American or German, they used. But they formed what was called the Beaumont Schrader Company, and they took over the marketing and promotion of this development. Schrader initially was vice president, had an office down in Detroit, but eventually moved out here to Highland and would later become very active in the development and management of what was then Duck Lake Golf Course. Eventually, I think he owned it for a time. Now, Beaumont's property on White Lake was originally a solid peninsula, as we can see on this 1909 USGS map. But there was a low marshy area that kind of ran north-south down through the middle of it that could easily be dredged out and turned into a canal. And when the time came to develop that, the construction of such a canal made a bit of sense. For one thing, it would provide direct lake access to what would otherwise be backlots. And second, it would mean that all of the lots that were on the east side of the canal would be on an island, man-made, but nonetheless an island, and that had a certain marketing appeal to it. I'm unsure whether the idea for this canal was there from the beginning or only arose later, but I have reason to believe that it wasn't actually dug out until like 1926. For one thing, all the ads and articles in 24 and 25 don't make any mention of a canal, bridges, island, anything like that. The first mention of Seven Harbors having an island comes in February of 27, after which the phrase is used more or less regularly, a private island. Okay. The second reason I think the canal was dug in 26 is this. In January of 1926, Beaumont applied for and was granted a patent for the last piece of government property that was ever sold in Highland Township. A 40-acre parcel that is described as the southeast quarter of the northeast quarter of Section 12. And the reason it took so long to sell is that most of it's underwater. Nobody bothered to buy it until then. The only reason I can think of why Beaumont would want to buy it is if he was preparing to maybe do some dredging in that area to bring up some sand, or maybe create a channel that led to this canal. So when you put those two things together, it suggests to me at least that this canal was opened up in the 1926 period. There's a lot more I could say about Beaumont and Seven Harbors. He's the one, for example, who gave the land up there on the corner of Duck Lake and Jackson Boulevard for a school that we call the Beaumont School. That's now what, the Eagles Lodge. And there are other references to ball fields and summer camps and whatnot. Development used to have a big clubhouse, which was later torn down and made into a residential lot. But in any event, I need to talk about one more big name in the early history of our lake development, and that's this fellow, Manly D. Davis. He was born in 1879 and a descendant of the family that established Davisburg, where he himself would later have a summer home. He was by training a lawyer, admitted to the bar in 1901, but he soon turned his attention to real estate and joined with his father, Daniel Davis, to form the Davis Investment Company, which was particularly active in the development of Bloomfield Hills. Some of you may remember the old Fox and Hounds that was there on Woodward, Square Lake. That was a Manly Davis project that was inspired by a trip he took to Oxford in the early 1920s. Now, since Davisburg is just up the road from Highland, I'm sure Manly was not only familiar with Duck Lake, but as a savvy real estate guy, was also recognized its development potential. So in the late teens or early 20s, the Davis Investment Company began buying up and platting several large tracts that were on the east and northeast shore. The first one is Duck Lake Subdivision number 1, which is accessed by DeVista and Dean Drive. DeVista, by the way, is a very clever portmanteau or mashup of Davis and Vista, because that road had a nice view of the lake, at least until all the houses got jammed in there. Dean Drive, by the way, is named for Alonzo Dean, whose family owned not only this piece, but a lot of other Duck Lake acreage. After that, Davis then platted Duck Lake Subdivision number 2, which was on the north shore, east of what is now Highland Hills Drive, and Duck Lake Park, which is on the west side. Now, one of the questions that I am often asked has to do with the peninsula that is accessed by a Flynn Drive. Was it once an island? And the answer is yes, it was, as we can see on this old plat and some other older maps. What's more, it had a name. Anybody know what the name of that island used to be? It was Butterball Island. Not for the turkey, but for this little guy. The butterball, or also known as bufflehead duck, which is said to have been a very frequent visitor to the lake and may very well have been the source of the lake's name. Anyway, since the island was part of the land that Davis acquired, he decided to subdivide that too into 18 40-foot wide lots. Now, understand that initially there was no plan to build any sort of causeway or bridge. These were all supposed to be summer cottages. So instead, if you bought a lot on the island, you were given an assigned parking spot on shore and access to a dock that you could then row out to the island. And that just sounds charming in the abstract, but let's face it, nobody is going to want to drive out from Detroit in a Model T, get there at 7 o'clock at night, unload the car, load up the boat, row the boat to the island, unload the boat, take it in the cottage, turn around, have to do it all again Sunday afternoon and drive back to Detroit, particularly if we have one of our notorious thunderstorms. So needless to say, it wasn't too long before the causeway that is now Flynn Drive was constructed. Just when, I can't say, I think it was in the late 20s or early 30s, certainly by 1940 when this aerial was taken. If you want to know why it has that curve in it, that's where the sandbar was. And so why dump more dirt than you need to? So they just followed the line of the sandbar, line of least resistance, and that's Flynn Drive. We also have an old postcard of it. This was taken, I think, from the Duck Lake side of Seven Harbors, looking west. And we see the island with a couple buildings, and the power poles indicate that they had electricity out there by then. Now, among other interests, Davis was an avid golfer. At various times, he was president of the Pine Lake Country Club on Orchard Lake Road. He was a director of Bloomfield Hills Country Club. And he's also the one that donated the land up at Davisburg that has become Springfield Oaks with a golf course. So he knew how having a nearby golf course or country club could boost the prestige and marketability of a resort community. So it's no surprise that if we look at this brochure for Butterball Island, it says a syndicate is negotiating for a portion of the property to build a golf course as the topography of the ground is considered ideal. I confess I don't have access to any records that Highland Hills may still have regarding its history, but I suspect this syndicate included not only the Davis Investment Company, but probably Giddings, since he not only was developing Lester Park, but actually served as real estate agent for some of those Davis lots. And of course, as we saw, Arnold Schroeder was partner with Beaumont and later went on to manage the golf course. In any event, anyone who is developing land in that part of White Lake or Duck Lake would have had a clear interest in seeing this golf course built. As to when it was built, there was some newspaper ads from April of 1925, which indicate it was under construction. And there's a published biography of Davis that indicates that it was opened in 1928. Now we're getting near the end, but I do want to say some more things about Duck Lake and its official lake level, because this is fascinating. As we saw, that drain that they installed in 1886 dropped the water level by roughly 3.5 feet. And that's where it stayed for the next 35 years. But in 1921, the Wardlow family that owned the land there at the southern end of the lake, and the Wilhelm family that owned the land there on the western side of Duck Lake, reportedly obtained the permission from the drain commissioner to install a new outlet. They took and built a watertight box around the original drain outlet, and as a result, raised the level of the lake 3.5 feet, pretty much back to where it had originally been. Needless to say, this flooded all of that land that had been uncovered in 1886, but nobody complained. And the reason I suspect nobody complained is that the people that owned the rest of the lake were all these developers, Davis, Giddings, Beaumont, and to have the lake level brought back up would have only enhanced the value of their lakefront lots. Now, this drain would undergo some other changes over the years. For example, that bridge that carried Wardlow Road over the open ditch, that was taken out, and they just continued the pipeline south under the road. And then in 1953, a canal was dug from the south end of Duck Lake to a little bay there. You can see that when you compare the open ditch in the 1940 photograph with the canal in the 63 photograph. So they installed a new inlet at the south end of this canal and bay. More recently, the development of South Bay Shores has required the underground piping to be relocated so that they could make a couple of those lots buildable. So now it wanders around the property lines there by Vero Drive before it goes under Wardlow. But the drain's still there. This is a photo I took of it last summer. The large opening with the grate is the drain for the lake. The smaller one on the right is the drain for the stormwater runoff from South Bay Shores. Now, this restoration of the lake level leads to one last story about Duck Lake that, as an attorney, I just find fascinating. But since the parties may still be around, I'm just going to call them Mr. A and Mr. B. Some of you may know who they are. It would only take a couple minutes on Google to figure out who they are, but that's the way I'm going to refer to them. As I mentioned at our last presentation, the old government surveyors really didn't care about the underlying topography when they ran their section lines. So if a section line or even a township boundary cut through a piece of property so as to make it landlocked, so be it. My favorite example of this is a lot which is in Seven Harbors on the east side. The only way to get to it by land is off of Lakeview Drive, and yet it is in White Lake Township because the border runs right down through the middle of that little point. So everything on that point to the east has a White Lake Township tax number, even though you can't get to it except by boat from White Lake. There was a similar situation at the southwest part of Duck Lake, basically where Vero Drive runs up into Apollo. And as you can see, the section line between 11 and 14 runs east-west, and prior to 1886, there was a little bay or inlet that was just nicked by that section line, so that as a result, this strip above the label of section 14 was landlocked. The only way that the owner of the southern part of the property could get to it was either by boat or by trespassing over his neighbor's land in section 11 to the north. Of course, once the drain went in and the lake level dropped, the bay receded such that there was some dry land there that you could get to that section if you wanted to. Why you'd want to, I have no idea. There was nothing particularly special about it, but in theory you could. But of course, once the Wardlows and Wilhelms raised the lake level in 21, the water level came back up and the little bay once more crossed the section line and rendered that little strip inaccessible. Now, obviously, since the Wardlows had been responsible for raising the lake level, they didn't care. But by the late 50s, both of these parcels had new owners. Mr. A owned the south piece, while Mr. B owned the north piece in section 11. Now, before the augmentation wells went in, the actual level of Duck Lake could vary considerably, particularly in dry weather. And on one such occasion, it was dry enough that the water actually left that little bay and created some dry land there. So Mr. A, the owner of section 14, decided that he would bring in some dirt and build a road across the bay so that he could reach that little piece. Needless to say, Mr. B objected strenuously on the grounds that that would destroy his access to the lake at that point once the water level came back up. And why would Mr. B care about accessing the level or the little bay there? Well, if he ever developed that, any lots that could reach the water from that little inlet would obviously be worth more. So this thing went to court, And at trial, there was a lot of testimony from elderly members of both the Wilhelm and Wardlow families about the history of the lake and the drain and so forth. Very interesting reading. But in any event, Mr. A made two arguments. First of all, he said, well, it was dry when I put the dirt in there, right? And it's my property, I'm entitled to dump the dirt. And the court said, no, riparian rights are based on the usual and customary lake level, not seasonal variation. So you can't take advantage of the fact that it was dry that summer. The other argument Mr. A made is fine. That restoration of the lake level in 1921 must have been illegal because the drain commissioner has absolutely no records showing that they ever gave permission for it. Think about that, okay? Imagine if you owned lakefront property all around this lake for 30 years and then somebody said, well, we got to drop it 3 feet. Court said, no, we're sorry, Mr. A. Among other things, too much time has gone by, and besides, you were the one that wanted that canal. And when they put the new drain in at the end of that canal at the south end, they used the 1921 level. So since you didn't object to it then, you can't object to it now. Undaunted, A appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court, which went through all the arguments, and they finally issued an opinion in favor of Mr. B in January of 1961. Now, you would think that would be the end of it, right? Michigan Supreme Court has spoken. In fact, there would be 3 more lawsuits that dragged on for almost a decade. In one case, Mrs. A sued the drain commissioner directly, seeking an order to compel him to drop the lake. In another case, somehow or another, the Oakland County Board of Supervisors was persuaded to file a suit for declaratory judgment to get a determination of the lake level. I don't know whether Mr. A had enough political pull to cause them to file it, but he did intervene in that suit. And lastly, when both of those were thrown out, he decided, well, look, I own the bottom under that bay. I'm going to put a fence. The posts sit on my land. So he starts building a fence. Mr. B promptly rips it out, and Mr. A sues him for trespass. That one, Mr. A also lost. He appealed it to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals basically said, look, this is the 4th lawsuit. The Supreme Court has already ruled as to what the lake level should be, 1,016.63 feet above sea level. And if you file a 5th lawsuit, you're going to have to post a bond for everybody else's costs and attorney fees. And that threat was apparently enough to finally bring this saga to an end. But just imagine if you owned lakefront property and suddenly realized that your lake level is going to drop by 3 feet because nobody could find any records. Anyway, if you live on Duck Lake, it might be fun to get some t-shirts printed up. Duck Lake, ruled to be 10/16/63. And if somebody asks you, what in the world does that mean? And you can tell them the long, convoluted saga of Mr. A and Mr. B. And with that, I will come to a conclusion and open it up to any questions. Anybody have anything? Yes, sir.
The parcel you just spoke about, is that the actual Baker's Beach? Close to where the beach is.
It's close to where the boat launch. Yeah. Yep, that's the one. Yes, ma'am.
Has this been recorded?
Yes.
On the north end of Duck Lake, they have an area that are a series of canals that is in a swampy area. It's called, referred to the zoo area for the kids. Do you have any clue why the developer put those in?
Yeah. They were supposed to be boat slips.
Oh, wow.
You know?
Marshy boats.
Yeah, extremely.
Thank you.
Kathy?
I just had someone online who said, can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Okay. I forgot to do that. I apologize. The last question had to do with the, for lack of a better word, notches that are in the north shore of Duck Lake, principally on the east side of Flynn Drive. There's a bunch of them. And those, I believe, were the boat slips or areas where it was expected to dock boats. Yes, sir.
Comment on the Ramada Canal.
I confess I've not researched that. Ramada Canal
Correct.
in Oxford Acres.
Correct.
Okay. I haven't gotten to that one. Oxford Acres went in the 60s and or at least started. That would be a whole night presentation. I remember that when that went in. I remember when Harvey Lake Road was dirt, tree covered, you know, so forth. Are there any other questions on Zoom, Kathy?
Yes.
Anyone else? You're
What is
having
the
it.
maximum depth of the lakes?
You're referring to the zoo with the canal, not east of, but west of. Yes. So there are these canals
Oh, the
right in front of LaFontaine's house. Yeah. What were those? Were they dredged out for some purpose or?
I think they had hopes down the road of being able to fill. It's almost like a network. Let me see if I can.
Yes, it looks like a network.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe they're hoping to develop.
I think so. You know,
Okay, so they dredged out some.
they dredged, and then of course state regulation comes in and filling them in, and you know.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
There are not 7 harbors and 7 harbors. You know why it's called 7 harbors?
I have absolutely no idea why. Unless it had to do with, you know, that ad that talked about the 7 celestials, whatever, 7th heaven, I guess it was. It's catchy. And in fact, the question was about why is it called 7 harbors? And the answer is I really don't know. There was another ad, whole series of ads that were called Follow the Sevens to 7 Harbors. And they went out and they tacked big 7s on the telephone poles, all the way from Detroit up Pontiac and out. And kind of like the things you see they do now with traveling circuses, you know, that give the directions for where the circus caravan should go. And so the idea was to follow the 7s on out to 7 harbors. But I don't know why that. I've pondered that a lot. Kathy.
So we have a couple questions from Zoom.
Okay.
One says, what can you tell us about the lighthouse?
Ah.
Lighthouse windmill at the end of Flynn.
Oh boy. I knew somebody was going to ask that question. The question is, what about the lighthouse and the windmill? And so I prepared an encore. And let me begin by saying that the 20s and 30s were the heyday of what's called novelty architecture or mimetic architecture or programmatic architecture, buildings that looked like something else. And it became especially popular because people are getting in their cars and they're going out driving. And if you're tooling down the road and you're hungry and you see a building that looks like a giant hot dog or a coffee stand that looks like a giant coffee pot, I mean, that's just fun. You've got to pull in there, right? I mean, original White Castles actually had towers and battlements, okay? So this was an extremely popular style of architecture for commercial use, and it began to spill over into residential use as well. A lot of tourist cabins adopted little thematic architecture, and even some private cottages. I don't know how many of you have been up to Grand Marais, the Pickle Barrel house, William Donnelly's cottage that was in the shape of a giant pickle barrel. Anyway, we have two of these novelty buildings that were built on Duck Lake. This one is out on the island, and I've had some people refer to it as a windmill, but I've never seen any evidence that it actually had any blades or sails or anything like that. I do think it was intended to be a lighthouse, both in terms of what it looks like and the fact that it's right there on the southern tip of Butterball Island. What we do know is this: it was built in 1921. The round tower is 20 feet in diameter, had 18-foot high ceilings, and was the living space. And then there was originally a single-story rectangular wing that had the bedrooms, kitchen, and bath. As a 38, we have some old assessment records that show that it had electricity, stove for heat, and indoor plumbing. What's interesting about it is that the original owner is identified here as Myrtle F. Davis. And you think to yourself, aha, must be some relative of Manly Davis, and you'd be right. But the problem is, it took me a whole day of research to figure out exactly who she is, because most of the online Davis genealogies ignore her for reasons that'll become apparent. Turns out she was Manly Davis's stepmother. The old man, Daniel Davis, married 3 times. His first wife, who was Manly's mother, died in 1886 when Manly was just a little boy. Daniel then married a second time in 1899, but divorced wife number 2 in 1917. And finally, in 1919, Daniel married a 3rd time to Myrtle Fessenden, so that's where the Myrtle F comes from. And since there are some records that give her occupation as nurse, I had the suspicion she may have been his live-in caretaker. But in any event, he was 72, she was 45. So there was a 27-year age difference between them, which may be why Manly and his siblings weren't too keen on having a stepmother who's basically the same age as they were. It's interesting that Daniel and Myrtle went out to Lansing to get married, even though they both lived in Pontiac. But anyway, that's who owned it. Built in 1921, and I suspect it may have been a belated wedding present for the wife. She owned it well into the 30s, and then it was apparently sold to Henry Nicholson in Detroit, about whom I know absolutely nothing. The second novelty building was a true, or meant to be, a lighthouse. And we actually have a pretty good picture of it, thanks to the Lansing State Journal of all places. This thing was built in 1929 on the first lot to the east of Flynn Drive. So the lot right on the left-hand side as you start going south onto the causeway. And if you look, the Lansing State Journal used to run a weekly auto tour itinerary for motorists that wanted to get out and take Sunday drive. And this time in August of 29, they gave directions for a tour of some lakes here in Northwest Oakland County, including Walled Lake with the amusement park, and then up to Crescent Lake. And they finally ended up at Duck Lake. And if you look here to the left of the car, left of center, there's a photo that is labeled lighthouse, or windmill on Duck Lake, and I've blown it up. So there it is. It was built right near the shoreline. Had some little fake sails on it. A couple of things that are interesting about it is that it was built as a cottage, and the original owner was Davis Investment Company. So conceivably it was built as a marketing gimmick, or maybe as an office for their on-site salesman to sign you up, or they could have used it for.
It's like it's flooded almost.
Well, this, when somebody mentioned the zoo this is what I thought you meant, these little keys that come in there on the side of Flynn Drive. Anyway, this thing was a 2-story tower, sitting room down below, bedroom up above, and a lean-to. They had a kitchen, but there's no running water, no plumbing. What's interesting is that the tower is a heptagon, 7-sided. Most Dutch windmills are either octagons or a few hexagons, but this one's got 7. It should have been over at 700. But in any event, it stayed there, underwent a bunch of modifications over the years. It was probably intended to be temporary. There was no foundation. It was just laid on posts, wood posts in the ground. The last time it shows up is in a county aerial photograph of 1980. So I'm sure it either fell in or was taken down after that. And today that lot is completely clear. So that's all I know. This was the old assessment record. See, it's 7-sided. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I heard there used to be a restaurant on Duck Lake or inn or.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
We have an original source here.
Okay.
It says there was.
There was.
The vista
Uh-huh.
was on the right-hand side, just as the vista makes the turn.
Okay.
When there's that big vacant lot, right next to it was the Palio.
Yeah.
That's where it was.
I've heard of it, and I've heard of it, and the reason I've heard of it is I did an abstract. We're talking about the Palio that used to be on Duck Lake. The old Highland Book of Health Board records says a lot about that place. So that's. Yeah. Like I said, there's no, we could spend a week just on one of these lakes. They're just fascinating. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
If I missed it, I apologize. How did White Lake get its name? And also, were any of these developers involved in building the White Lake Inn?
The first question is, how did White Lake get its name? And the story is that it got its name due to the appearance of the lake, you know, when the sun is shining. There's just a big white sheet of water. Did any of these developers, I'm sorry.
Were they involved in developing the White Lake Inn?
No. White Lake Inn went in 1913, as I recall. So it's a century old. And it was just truly an inn. I mean, some of the old ads for it, you could go out and spend the night, had rooms upstairs, and so it was kind of a, pardon?
We heard those rooms had a lot of stories.
Yeah, but it was part of that resort movement, which then sort of collapsed because around 1915, shortly after it was built, it was on the market. Yes.
Was your granddaughter involved with your encore, asking online?
No.
My question is this though, west of White Lake Inn on Jackson Boulevard.
Right.
When you're looking south, that island there,
Dawson's Island.
okay?
Yeah.
Growing up as a kid, we were always told, don't ride your snowmobile over there because of it's spring fed. Anything on that, or are kettle lakes normally spring fed?
Yeah, it's not unusual. Yeah. I mean, as we talked last time, Kettle Lake is a piece of dead ice that gets surrounded by silt. That ice, as it moved, was generally scraping either bedrock or hard clay, something that was more or less impervious. So as the ice melts, you've now got a bottom layer that any water percolating, you know, it sort of forms that first aquifer, if you will. So springs are very common, and yes, springs are notorious for being unsafe. I mean, that water is coming out of there at 38 degrees, let's say, above freezing. It rises because it's warm, and any ice over top of it is going to be thinner than the surrounding water. But Dawson's Island, it used to be called Fisher Island. I didn't go into it in this because it's on the White Lake side, you know. And I don't know how they built that house out there. I know there was a big controversy about plans to build a bridge over to that island, and that was eventually nixed. But yeah.
Now all those cottages that were once there, all these big houses.
Yes.
Former garages, or the cottages were the garages now. in this new-
Well, it's interesting. It's like anything else. I mean, there are parts of Highland, downtown Highland, that have burned down, been rebuilt, burned down again. There's just an evolution to this. And what I find fascinating is how seemingly worthless land to a pioneer farmer is now top dollar. That's I think the biggest thing. Anyone else? Any other questions? I'm so glad somebody asked about the windmill. Kathy.
Did the golf course property extend down to the lake at any time? I've heard rumors there were bathhouses at the foot of the Flynn Drive Causeway.
Okay, the question is, did the golf course property ever extend down to the lake? Since the golf course and the lake development were all originally Davis Investment Company property, I guess in one sense, the answer to that question is yes. And given that a lot of those lots didn't initially sell, I could see them, just like with this windmill, wanting to put in some sort of accommodations. Let me go back here to this. Okay. I mean, here is an old postcard, golf course at Duck Lake near Milford. Upper one is of the clubhouse, but you know, they've got this lower view showing Duck Lake with a dock out there. It wouldn't surprise me. It's part of an amenity. And then once maybe somebody built the lot, or bought the lot, put a cottage on it, the bathhouses disappeared. Any other quick questions? All right, I hope you found it interesting, but thank you.